Thank you very much for inviting me. Masha, Anya, Talk, Kindle, thank you very much for the support. You made my presentation so much prettier than I ever imagined it to be. And I will say, as kind of like a few of disclaimers about the presentation, I'll be reading some of it. Some of it will have a discussion. I know it's getting late and we're running a bit late with the schedule, but bear with me. Any questions, feel free to ask as well in between, because we're going to be dealing with law, which Anan said at the beginning of their talk that it's going to be maybe fun and fast. So I'm sorry, I don't know how to do fun and fast with this. And it's about, again, legal matters, and do they matter? And I will try and claim that in some ways they do matter, in some ways they do not. Masha was saying that I will kind of like summarize the exhibition in terms of its legal maybe component, but this is not what I'm going to do, because the exhibition is great and the exhibition is important that it does tackle and it does address legal and law issues as part of it. And I think this is sometimes my argument with curators, with artists, that legal needs to be addressed more directly, and it's something that we should not leave without notice. At the same time, again, I will go back to the exhibition and give some of my sort of comments or try to broaden it with artists that I have been working with, through exhibitions that I have been presenting that dealt quite directly with questions of law and legality. Sorry. But at the same time, yeah, we'll go kind of like back to the exhibition, and we'll discuss, hopefully at the end, it's kind of like a conclusion, this large wall with the line of law matters and legal components that are at the very entrance to the exhibition. And I find this is very important, especially in our times, especially here in Germany, and this is something that I feel very strong about. But before, again, it's like, I don't know if it's another disclaimer, but this is already part of the talk itself, and I'll notice the time, although I know someone will give me some sign. So, as a short and preliminary comment, I will be dealing in a sense with the sort of like part of the exhibition, which is called Legalized Violence and Embodied Resistance. I guess you have noticed if you visited the exhibition. If not, please do so. But one part of it is really, and I think Ulrika and Clara, this was as well something that you looked into, the idea of legalized violence, embodied resistance. But I want to add as a comment that, and this is something I wish to begin with in this first part of the, regarding this title, because I think it's important to notice that and to stress that violence is intrinsic in the relationship with law and legalized violence and the law. The idea that violence is at the base of the law can be traced back, for example, to Immanuel Kant in the Metaphysics of Morals, and we're going like 18th century. However, in my talk here, and what I find important is Jacques Derrida, in his writing Force of Law from 1992, the mystical foundation of authority, who, unlike Kant, directly addresses the violence embedded in law when he writes, and I quote, I should have put the quotes, if I'll repeat it. Since the origin of authority, the founding or grounding, the position of the law cannot, by definition, rest on anything but themselves. They are themselves a violence without ground. This is not to say that they are themselves unjust in the sense of illegal or illegitimate. They are neither legal or illegal. They are neither legal nor illegal in their founding moment. Right? I'll go back to it so we'll understand again the intrinsic relation between law and violence. And as the title of this section is Legal as Violence, I think we can understand together the idea of saying law and talking about legal matters has to all the time pay attention and take into consideration the idea that violence is embedded in the law. We need to understand and remember that law's validity and the manner in which the law functions is always dependent on the need to be enforced. As such, law repeats in every act of its performance its initial violence, which is legal as it is based on law and also illegal as it is based on its illegal foundation. Derrida expounds on two expressions used by French Renaissance philosopher Michel Montaigne, the mystical foundation of authority and legitimate fiction. For Derrida, the mystical foundation, or the legitimate fiction that stands at the foundation of the law and guarantee our obedience to the law, amounts to force rather than justice. The law is inaugurated by an originary violence that endows it with its authority. Laws, and I quote, are not just as laws. One obeys them not because they are just, but because they have authority. The authority of the law rests on nothing but itself, and therefore, as I mentioned, amounts to groundless violence. That violence, which cannot be defined as either just or unjust, thus forms the mystical foundation or the legitimate fiction of the law, and as such, it also opens the law up to interpretation. And interpretation is something that we will try to do as well in this talk. But now, as I hopefully explained shortly through the idea that violence is an important part of law, and we cannot talk about law and legal matters or legalization of anything without thinking about violence, I want us to watch a very short video clip. It's not a video clip; it's a film. It's the beginning of Orson Welles' The Trial film from 1962. The Trial by Franz Kafka, and again 2.5 minutes, in which I hope that you can, as late as it is, pay attention to the text that is read and the image that we see in order to have an idea of what I want to continue talking when it comes to the entrance to the law. Please.
Before the law, there stands a God. A man comes from the country begging admittance to the law. But the God cannot admit him. Can he hope to enter at a later time? That is possible, says the God. The man tries to peer through the entrance. He had been taught that the law should be accessible to every man. Do not attempt to enter without my permission, says the God. I am very powerful, yet I am the least of all the gods. From hall to hall, door after door, each god is more powerful than the last. By the god's permission, the man sits down by the side of the door, and there he waits. For years, he waits. Everything he has, he gives away in the hope of bribing the god, who never fails to say to him, I take what you give me, only so that you will not feel that you have left something undone. Keeping his watch during the long years, the man has learned to know even the fleas in the god's fur collar. And growing childish in old age, he begs the very fleas to persuade the god to change his mind and allow him to enter. His sight is dimmed, but in the darkness he perceives a radiance streaming immortally from the door of the law. And now, before he dies, all his experience condenses into one question, a question he has never asked. He beckons to the god. Says the god, you are insatiable. What is it now? Says the man, every man strives to attain the law. How is it then that in all these years no one else has ever come here seeking admittance? His hearing has failed, so the god yells into his ear, no one else but you could ever have obtained admittance. No one else could enter this door. This door was intended only for you. And now, I am going to close it. This tale is told during the story called The Trial. It has been said that the logic of this story is the logic of a dream, of a nightmare.
Okay, I don't know if it was clear enough in terms of the sound. Did anyone read Before the Law? This very short story by... This can wait a bit, although you can leave it. So we have some images. Thank you. Anyone knows the story Before the Law? 1915, it was published already in the lifetime of Kafka, and unlike many of his writings that were published afterwards by Max Brod. But it's not very important, just to give you the background, that then it was as well part of the trial, and then this is part of, and what we saw now is one work, as I said, by Orson Welles, that deals with the idea of coming before the law. In this particular story, it's a man from the land, a man outside of town comes, and it's worth reading it, and I will not summarize to you, but I will refer to it now, so that if there's any questions, let me know, okay? So the story of the man from the country, the person from the land, who travels to the entrance of the law in hope of crossing it, of carving a path for himself in the labyrinth of the law, and finds himself before a doorkeeper, puts the reader in a state of confusion and awe. The man begs admittance to the law, tells us Kafka, but he's fated, so it seems, to end his life before the law. The doorkeeper has no need for physical force or violence, for his intimidating appearance, as well as his hints to even more terrifying doorkeepers awaiting by the halls of the law inside, suffice to make it clear to the man from the country that it's better for him to sit and wait. So again, violence and the law. Days and years will pass, and the man from the country, holding to his belief that the law should surely be accessible at all times and to everyone, and this is, I'm quoting from the translation to English, that the law should be accessible at all times and to everyone, will grow old and gray, exhausted. Before his death, he will nonetheless find the audacity to ask the doorkeeper how it could be that everyone strives to attain the law. Yet, in all the years that he has been waiting, no one has come but him. In response, the doorkeeper will bellow in his ear, informing him and us that this door was intended for him alone and only for him, and that now, and again, he has been waiting years and getting old in front of the doorkeeper and in front of the law, before the law, this door will be shut by the doorkeeper. Before the law aptly demonstrates the functioning of the law, whose force and influence do not begin and end in its doors. Even if we imagine the law as concentrated inside a physical body or place that the door represents, the domination of the law over persons, over citizens, reaches far and wide without restraint. Long before the man from the country successfully arrives before the law as a person, he is already part of a state ideology that implements him with the recognition of the law as omnipresent. He takes it as a matter of course, the man from the country, that all people, without exception, seek to take refuge in the law, to know it from inside and even live inside it and from within its bounds. The man from the country, therefore, obeys the doorkeeper without any physical or verbal protest. And in so doing, he affirms that he is a law-abiding person without the legal system having to use physical force or violence to impose its authority. Indeed, the man from the country does not contest the superiority of governmental institutions and law enforcement, even as he is fated to die helpless before the law. But what if there is another way? Returning to Derrida in his essay titled the same as Kafka's short story Before the Law, the secret of the story lies in the tension between the promise of accessibility imagined in the law, whose door, so it goes, remains open always, and its insistence to remain prohibited, unattainable, impossible, and impenetrable. Here, however, it becomes possible to detect a connection between the man from the country and the doorkeeper. If initially it seems that the two stand as opposite poles, Derrida suggests that they share, in effect, a common space. Both share a space in relation to the law. One stands with his face to it, the other with his back. The essential reciprocity between the doorkeeper and the man from the country does not suffice, not at this stage anyway, to breach the existing structure of power and permit their joint entrance into the law. So this does not happen. They don't join, as we see in the film and as we know from the tale of Kafka, they do not join forces together. Something that we mention here, and I think maybe at the Q&A or afterwards we can talk about the idea of joining forces between institutions and persons when they come before the law. Had they joined forces, these two might have changed the matter of things. They could have resisted and transformed the law and perhaps even found ways to see beyond it. The hegemonic rule of the state authorities prevents solidarity. Another thing that we spoke, or that was mentioned today, solidarity between the one who persists in standing before the law until the end of his life and the one who remains firm in his obedience to the institution that recruited him as a guard of the door. The state of the man from the country is twofold. He is a subject of the law, and at the same time, he cannot find his place inside the law. He is ejected from it to the extent that he can almost be conceived as an outlaw. And I think this is another thing that we mentioned today, which might be interesting in the story, the idea that he is obedient to it, but maybe, and this I will summarize the idea of this tale of Kafka, but maybe he brings other forces, other powers, other sense of activism with him. So what if there was another way? Perhaps, in his absolute loyalty, the man from the country affords us a glimpse, possibly even an entry into the law. Perhaps, in parting with all his belongings, as Kafka tells us that he does, in an attempt to bribe the doorkeeper, the man from the village indicates to us a possibility of breaching the door of the law, of breaking it, of embodied resistance. Perhaps in his life, as well in his death, this determined man, this determined person who is in his desperation pleading to the fleas in the doorkeeper's fur collar, perhaps he instructs us to break new paths into the law. The man from the country maintains order, as I mentioned, and respects the law's conventional rules of conduct. According to Agamben, to Georgi Agamben, in Masai and the Sovereign, we must consider the man's determination as evidence for the possibility of taking action before the law. If we are willing to account for its ending, wherein the doorkeeper announces the closing of the door, this story is not only one of failure and of defeat. The man's sit-in before the door of the law has indeed brought about change, and for evidence, the door is no longer open, but closed. Agamben sees the man's unwavering endurance before the law a quiet, long-term strategy. I think this is something, again, that we mentioned, how to create new strategies. Strategy that allows him to intervene with and disrupt the power of the law. As Mostafa Taharini writes, the man, and I quote, is not staying in an endless suspension, but he has a patient strategy that ultimately leads to the closing of the gate of law and overwhelming the ruling structure. So this is the tale of Kafka, which I find very inspiring, and I hope I could share some of it with you. As I go to the, so to say, the second part of the talk, and I think I'm in good time, no? Yes? Thank you. So I was thinking a lot, and again, as I said, and the invitation, as I understood it, was in a sense to broaden the idea of legality and how it's conceived in this exhibition. And the first thing really that I saw in the exhibition was this large wall with laws inscribed on it from, I think, 1897 till today, in a sense. So this brought the first reaction to me, this almost physical reaction, but as well contemplating on the idea of being before the law, because you just enter the exhibition, you come out, at least when I came out of the elevator, this is the first thing you see. So you stand before the law. So before the law, and I didn't do research about how often it was used by artists or different institutions, but I did find, for example, that there was an exhibition in 2012. It's considered the last exhibition that Caspar Koenig curated. And it was about sculptures, as it says here, post-war sculptures and spaces of contemporary art, and it was shown at the Ludwig Museum in Cologne. I think this is one example of how, at least in 2012, oftentimes when institutions or when artists have been dealing with law or with legal matters, it was kind of an illustration of the law. So I think the idea of using before the law by Kafka for this exhibition was really to think about human rights in the 60 years after the Second World War and trauma, but really from a more illustrative idea. So this is one example. It's a beautiful work by Thomas Schütte, Vaterstadt from 2010, which might be representing the gatekeeper, maybe giving us another idea of what is the gatekeeper and how, as in Kafka, exploration of the gatekeeper, of this doorkeeper, there is a coat, there is a fur coat, but here, for example, his hands of this person are tied to his robe, and maybe this is part of what we want to say when we think about the law. When I go, can I do it with a pointer? If I know how to use it? Did I do it? Wow. Did you notice that when it was the film, I went back. I thought I'm disturbing you to watch it. I have a totally different understanding of my place in space. So I did this thing. There. Sorry. There? Okay, interesting. In any case, it is important for me because Carrie Young, for example, is an artist, a British artist, that has been very much involved and very much in line of how I think what we should, and what I'm sometimes sounding as a preacher, of how artists, curators, institutions, not necessarily legal institutions, but have to take in hand the idea that law is something that needs to matter or need to be approachable or that we need more knowledge of it in order to be able to fight, or in order to create solidarity, in order to change it, in order to amend it. And this is something that Carrie Young has been doing in the last 20 years. This is a project that is, again, is titled Before the Law, from 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And what she does is, unlike, for example, the exhibition from 2012, she goes really to the place of the law. She goes to the court. For example, here, she is given access to the law, while at the same time, if we think about Kafka and we think about the idea that law at the end is not accessible, or law at the end is even empty, or law at the end is not a place that one really wants to go into, but is inscribed to come before it. So this is what Carrie Young is telling us by taking pictures, for example, documenting courtrooms in different places, mostly from what I know in Europe. And what we see is images of doors, images of curtains, images that, again, put us before the law and allows a lot of, it allows her camera and allows her presence to come closer and reach out to the law, but at the same time, she's leaving out, or she's leaving us still in this place before the law. What we see, for example, glimpses of, for example, even more opaque, even more unclear, even more secretive, which is oftentimes what we know about the law. For example, but then you will have an image of a painting that has been hanging, for example, in the courtroom, that we will not have access to it, or we don't know about it. So this is part of the architecture of law, of course, that is built on, that is constructed in a way to not allow us entry into it, and this is what I think Kafka brings so beautifully in his writing, not only of Before the Law, but in other of his writings about legal matters. I will continue with another project of Carrie Young from 2023, in which again, so she goes forward. She goes, and in this case, she takes. It's a video installation of about 50 minutes long, installed in a very large scale, of images of judges, of female judges, in England, where she's based as well, which are, like this. Which are sitting in front of her, and again comes the idea of before the law, and who is the judge, and who can make a verdict, and who is talking, and who needs to maybe claim something or protect themselves. So these are the questions that Carrie Young is very much involved in, and this is again part of how I imagine what we can all be further going when we talk about the law and how to reach closer to the law. One of the things, for example, that she says as well in interviews and in the work itself is the diversity of the judges now, for example, female judges, and coming from different backgrounds, which is something that she puts an emphasis on as well, but I think as well something that we should continue thinking about is the changes that law has been going and the acceptance, for example, of more female judges, but it's still early, or it still needs to be researched and to be discussed, and definitely I think through art and through curatorial practice, how did that, if at all, affect the law and how it's perceived and how it's executed. And from Carrie Young, I want to go to another artist. Sorry. His name is Loris Abu Hamdan, and perhaps some of you have seen the show he had here in 2020 at the Hamburger Bahnhof. Again, I think, when I see this image at least, I think again about Before the Law. This work, I will tell you more information about it. Just a sec. Yeah, because it is dealing with the process of palatography, in which people are called in front of a doctor in order to check the way they pronounce words and how they speak. And the exhibition as well is called The Voice Before the Law. And this is one of the claims that Lawrence Abu Hamdan has been putting in the last, as well, I think more than a decade now, researching on elements of the voice. Because I think this is, and I find it, I have criticism of it, but there is a brilliant component to it, because oftentimes voice, for example, for asylum seekers, for refugees, this is the only thing that they will bring with them. When we think about refugees coming, and we had a lot, and it's something that is very much discussed here in Europe, but they're coming oftentimes without any kind of documentation, any kinds of identification. The way they tell their biography plays a very crucial part in their legal status here, for example. And he's talking here, for example, the status of refugees in the Netherlands, or he talks about the status of refugees and asylum seekers in the UK. But I think something that is very difficult for the law, and this is why art and artists and curators are so important, is how to bring those biographies into consideration through a legal trial or through any kind of like tribunal when they are silenced as well. So one of the things that what I see here again is a kind of like a gate into the way people vocal their language, but one of the things that he has been finding, and he has been working, as he calls himself, a private ear, sort of like detecting how people have been treated as asylum seekers and refugees here in Europe. And oftentimes, because their biographies are eliminated, are not part of what they can bring about as part of their claim, a legal claim to stay, for example, in Europe, they bring biographies from different areas of the world, and then they are judged, for example, if they claim that they are coming from Iraq, but they will have, for example, a Palestinian accent, or they will pronounce a word instead of that they claim, for example, they will come from a place in Africa, but then apparently they have been moving around, they have been securing their lives in different ways while learning different languages, and this has affected their legal status here in Europe. So this is Conflicted Phenoms from 2012. And this is another work by Abu Hamdan, in which, as I said, he did it in Utrecht, in which he was looking at 12 Somali citizens who had been subjected to the analysis of language and accent by the Dutch system of migration control, and whose application had been rejected. Working with linguistics, with researchers, with activists, culture organizations, and graphic designers, Lawrence Abu Hamdan is perhaps, his practice is known as part of the forensic architecture, an agency that has been dealing with a lot with architecture, violence, and legal issues, as well as part of the Goldsmith in London. So the diagrams that were designed as a result of the encounter of Lawrence Abu Hamdan are responses to the outcome of the rejection of the asylum. They offer a silent protest, purely visual, to the involuntary manifestation that the Somalis' voices had suffered. The diagram's density reflects the complex task of recording in these voices biographies of hunger and conflict, the necessary adoption of capacities of oral communication during long migratory journeys, and the vital obligation of hybridization and contamination during years in overcrowded refugee camps. The complexity of these maps is a performance of the voice that cannot be reduced only to a passport, and its inapplicability to fix people in space. So I'm reading this. This is the way it's described by Lawrence Abu Hamdan, in order for us to really understand how difficult it is to give legal status based on voice, based on how people are presenting themselves. So these were like 3 examples of before the law and how it comes about in law and art. So maybe the question is, as we go back to the title of the exhibition, is, does legal matter? And I'm very happy to hear from you if you think so, if legal matters to you. I think the first thing that we need to do, and this is what hopefully in this talk I have been emphasizing, we have to have knowledge, we have to come across, we have to be aware, we have to understand that we're standing oftentimes before the law. And this is a structure that, as I mentioned, is omnipresent, and we are all in one way or another are facing law and facing legal matters. So I would not force you to think that legal matters, but I do think that they do matter. And keeping in mind with legal matters and the violence origin of any law and the violence performed in any action of the law, I was reading the list of laws. Okay, it's from 1871, the first one in the list, which is titled Body Regulations in Germany, Healthcare, Legislative System, and State Control, in which abortions, sexual conduct, sterilization, euthanasia are enforced. And for me, reading those laws, yeah, exactly, thank you. Reading those laws, and as I said, being before those laws, I don't find it very surprising. The fact that about more or less 100 years later, we are experiencing again around the world the criminalization of abortion, for example, or the witch hunt of transgender people and migrants is utterly disturbing and needs to be fought against, but it is again nothing of a surprise. As Foucault has described in the history of sexuality, the body has been constitutive of the modern state of society and of the population. But I do want to look at our current time, at our current moment here in Germany, and I think this is what is so interesting about this list of laws, that they are dealing with Germany. And we are in a particular time now in Germany, not everyone maybe is from here, but definitely with the fallout of the government, with the rise of right-wing extremists, with populist parties, which are taking almost 50% of the votes of some of the states here in Germany, I think it's impossible not to look carefully at what is happening now here in terms of law and in terms of how we look at law. But at the same time, and I think this is something that I've heard here, I think from the first talk and following that it might be, and I think if I quote, Micha said something like, history is a continuation into the present. History is a way for us, perhaps, to penetrate the law or to go deeper and closer into the law than looking at the laws themselves. So what I found very interesting is, of course, this list of laws that allowed us an entry into the exhibition. At the same time, I think, and this is why it's interesting that it comes in historical context and it comes with those dates, that perhaps history allows us a better way into law and learning better into those laws. So looking at those modern times, I find that it's very helpful to methodologically look at the development of laws and their enforcement through a pendulum movement in time. As the list of laws regarding body regulations presented at the exhibition are German, and as the title of the symposium is Contested Bodies, I think that a pendulum movement of a century, if I'm talking about specifically about the 30s here, so it's about a period of 1 year, it is very relevant, and by doing so, I cannot personally avoid thinking of another German term, which is the Volkskörper, and it's used by the Nazis and its relevance to the discussion today. Again, I think we did mention Nazi ideology, the Nazi regime here, for example, from the same talk. But I do think if we do this pendulum movement between now and 100 years ago, not to say that history repeats itself, or not to say necessarily that what we're experiencing now is the time of the Weimar Republic or the Nazi regime, but I do think it's interesting in the context of embodied resistance and talking about the body, to think, for example, about a term like the Volkskörper, which was used by the Nazi regime, and it's not mentioned in the list of laws and regulations that are at the entrance to the exhibition, but I think we should know the ideology behind those laws and how they came to become laws at the time of the Nazi regime. Following the late Israeli historian Boaz Neumann, I see the Volkskörper as an actual concrete body. According to Neumann, Volkskörper is not a symbol or a metaphor for the nation, people, society, or state. In relation to the Volkskörper, in relation to the Fremdkörper, the foreign body of the Jewish body, Neumann asks, and I quote, if the Jewish Fremdkörper, this foreign body, was not a metaphor, and indeed the Nazis treated this body in distinctly non-metaphorical fashion, then why do we assume that the Volkskörper was essentially symbolic? Neumann continues to show how the Nazi corporal ontology did not rest on the individual's body, since such a body was vulnerable to biological whim. The individual body was one that invariably decayed. The Nazi corporal ontology was based on a body that did not degenerate. This was the Volkskörper, whose existence was autonomous of a specific body. According to Neumann, Volkskörper for the Nazis was exactly what it was, no more, no less. The body of a folk with life of its own, and had suffered mortal injuries as a result of the First World War, the rise of the Weimar Republic, and modern degeneracy in general. This Volkskörper then recovered and was even born again through the Nazi Revolution. Through an agenda filled with a discourse around diseases, infections, weakness, softness, Weimar Republic and democracy were portrayed as the ones that injured the Volkskörper further, and Hitler is the one that can heal it. I can show you, for example, Adolf Hitler als Arzt des deutschen Volkes. Adolf Hitler as the doctor of the German nation, 1935. through an agenda field, as I said, yeah, and Hitler is the one that can heal it. Or as Neumann writes, if the Volkskörper was a wounded body, then the Volkslieder were physicians. Another image that I find helpful to talk about the Volkskörper and to talk about again in historical terms about 100 years from now, and to think about again the situation that we're in now. So the Autobahn system, for example, which would reunite the regions of the new Reich, those already existent and those to be annexed, was none other than a creation of the life veins of the German Volkskörper that were to cure the wounds suffered by the land. The Autobahns, as a consistent part of the German Lebensraum, were not a lifeless design on a drawing board of a calculating art of the engineer, says Neumann. Rather, they were pulsing streets, veins of the German folk life in every respect. And this is taken for an exhibition, The Miracle of Life, that I think, yes, was at the was presented in Dresden at the Hygiene Museum. So again, I'm coming shortly to the end of my talk. I bring this up, and I bring the idea of law, and I bring the idea of history and how to look at law and history. And for example, as I said, this pendulum movement between now and then, in order to tell us that we have to be aware of things which are happening now. We talked here, for example, and one of the first questions to Micha was if there are any institutions who are engaged actively in new ways of protecting or having a different idea of body and health, for example, if I recall that correctly. And I know that oftentimes the answer here, at least in Berlin, but in Germany, is that there's no funding and there's no way of, I think one of the answers was it's very difficult by bodies funded by the state to come against, for example, extreme right parties like the AfD or populist parties, which are getting, as I said, almost 50%, if not more of it, in the elections in different states here in Germany. At the same time, and as someone like me who has a Jewish background, who comes, although I was born in Canada, I was raised in Israel and has this background, we see, for example, that there are funding for initiatives dealing, for example, with anti-Semitism in our time. And I think this is something that we should look at, how legislators, how policymakers are distributing, for example, funding, are distributing funding, or how the discourse is led. For example, yesterday was the opening of Nan Goldin exhibition at the Neue Nationalgalerie, and from what I saw online, she did address the genocide in Gaza, and she did address the idea of the constant situation of hostages in Israel. So this is definitely very important, and I don't come against this kind of statements, which are very important to be said and to be told. At the same time, I think something that I'm missing, and I think this is something that has to do with law and policymakers here in Germany, and not only in Germany, but I think it's more important and even more urgent here in Germany, is to deal with the idea of how institutions need to, and how people, of course, dealing with these institutions need to deal with right-wing extremes and populist movements and parties here in Germany. And this should be, as far as I'm concerned, the first thing that we want to fight and the first thing that we want to deal with when it comes to law. One of the claims is, for example, with the AfD, that it is impossible now to legally take it out of the political system. Perhaps it has been too late. Perhaps we have been quiet about it for too long. But it is something in the hands of law and policymakers that I urge, and I think this is when legal matters do matter. And I think this is something that we should be talking and dealing with because of the urgency of the matter at this moment. So I hope it all comes together for you as well. Thank you so much.